Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lunch seminar here at Chalmers. So, my name is Maria Gran. I am the director of Energy Area of Advance, which is a platform here at Chalmers for networking and collaboration, where we're working with interdisciplinary, challenge-driven collaboration projects and activities. So, I'm really happy to see so many of you here. And also, I realize that we have a few of you also online. So, for this streaming activity, if you have any questions during this seminar, please send them on an email. And the email address, you will be able to see it all during these 2 hours to energy@chalmers.se. So questions sent to energy@chalmers.se. That only applies to you online. If you want to ask questions here in the room, you just raise your hand and you will get your microphone, but you will be guided towards when it suits for questions by today's chairman. So the moderator today, we welcome Göran Bernders, and I hope you can present yourself.
Yes,
very welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Maria. I will make you happy to tell you that I will not speak so much. We have 3 really interesting presenters here today, so I will just give a brief introduction now first. And then I will try to keep order during the discussion afterwards, where we have our presenters on the scene. I will then have good help from Anki Nordin, who will also bring in questions from all around the world. I'm sure we are really testing the streaming capacity of Sweden right now. So you have the title for the seminar in front of you. I will just give you a brief context to the question raised here. I start with a diagram, 3 diagrams actually, but they kind of belong together, that I would like to explain what they show. So these diagrams are from the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. You will find similar diagrams in the 1.5 report that was released not too long ago. I expect you will see similar diagrams also in the 6th assessment report that will come out in a couple of years. So what you see here is an illustration of the use of biomass for energy on the global level. And you can see that it is presented with an y-axis showing how large part of the total energy supply that is provided by biomass. And this is what is found in scenario modeling studies aiming for different stabilization levels for greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You can also see that the diagrams show 3 different time steps, so to say, 2030, 2050, 2100. You have different colors here. So you have a gray, boring baseline color. Then you have 2 other colors. You have the kind of orange, yellowish one, which is a scenario where we do not really achieve so much in terms of stabilization of the temperature increase. And you have the blue that shows a stabilization level that was at that time considered to corresponding to a certain, quite good likelihood of staying below 2 degrees warming. I think likely in IPCC language is more than 66% or so. So what you see here, you will see that if you move over time, the contribution of biomass to the energy system increases. In particular, you will see that if we go more ambitious when it comes to reducing warming, you have more and more biomass over time. As you can see, the blue is generally representing a larger supply than the orange, and the gray is lowest. Then you have also an x-axis where you can read how many exajoules this is. and I'm sure that not all of you know how much an exajoule is, so it's difficult to relate to this. But if I tell you that 200 exajoules, that's roughly 10 times the global industrial roundwood production today, then you realize that this is really massive amounts of biomass that would be needed to meet these scenario developments here. So this is one of the context pictures I wanted to show. Here's the second one. This shows how we look at forestry in Sweden. It could also be considered a rather generic picture, but I used it here just to illustrate how the response so far has been to increasing biomass demand. That we see the forestry sector and also the agriculture sector responding by using existing resources more efficiently, wasting less, improving processes, and also developing new processes to convert residue flows and waste flows into biofuels, for instance, and also other products. And this is, of course, in many ways a very good response, because it helps us to waste less and we become more efficient. The basic point I want to make here is that this is far from sufficient in terms of providing the biomass that was envisioned in the earlier diagrams. As I said, the forest sector on global level uses maybe 10% of what you see as a future demand from the energy sector. So using residues and improving processes in existing systems will not be sufficient. What will be required is dedicated production of biomass for energy purposes. So a new type of land use, I would say, that will evolve over time. And we have already seen examples of dedicated production, not the least for liquid biofuels for transport, but so far mostly using conventional crops that we also use to feed animals or produce food products. This development that has kind of almost barely started towards these very high levels has already led to a lot of debate and questioning whether this is really a wise path to choose for climate stabilization. So already at the very small level of biomass use for energy that we have today, we have seen consequences, and we have seen many studies that come to conclusions that make them question whether this is the right way to go. And there are many different issues brought up, from food security to increased environmental impacts to the question of whether we deliver climate stabilization or reduce warming in time or too late, and so on. It's a myriad of questions. Today we will focus on the land use issues mostly, and then the question how we can produce more in dedicated systems, but to do it in ways that are not causing more harm, that possibly can even help us to reduce the impact that we see in agriculture and forestry today, mostly agriculture this session. So this goes back to our basic question here that we will now have three persons presenting about. That is how we can use our land resources more efficiently, and actually how we can use them to reduce impacts of the current agriculture systems that we see. So that was my short introduction. Now I will try to talk at the same time as I actually shift to the presentation for the next presenter. I'm sure that will work fine. Our next presenter is Uffe Jørgensen from Aarhus University. Came yesterday with the ferry in the middle of the night, have slept at a hostel at Slottsskogen. You look great, despite that. And I have seen you presenting this, and we have visited you in Denmark and seen what you present now, and it's so impressive. I hope that everyone here will understand how impressive it is. Please come and take over here. I will start.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's something else. Okay. Good morning, and I'm happy to be here with our partners in from Chalmers. We have a new project called Green Valleys, which I think is a pendant to the Silicon Valley. We will have some green valleys across Skagerrak and Östersund. I will talk about what we could do in intensive agriculture with the systems we have today. We think that we are very optimized in Denmark, at least, and most of Northern Europe. But my claim is that we can double productivity and half environmental impact from those systems. It's about which crop we choose to grow. But then secondly, it's also a lot about what can we do with that biomass that we produce more efficiently. And there comes a lot of technology into the picture, and that's why it's good to cooperate with you, I think. I'm taking my point of departure in Danish agriculture. We have 62% of our land in agriculture. Intensive agriculture, we have high precipitation, sandy soils, and a long coastline. It's a toxic cocktail that we are trying to deal with. But there are solutions, and I hope we will be able to discuss that in the end also. But even though it's, I take my point of departure in Denmark, I think it's quite similar to southern Sweden conditions and also most of northwestern Europe. Where we have similar intensive agriculture and also enough water, because that is a limitation many places in the world. But we should be happy about that much water we have and utilize it wisely for producing some of that much biomass that Jørgensen told us that we need for many purposes. Because our agriculture is challenged by this dilemma between productivity and environment, that there are many wishes for new uses of the biomass apart from the food and feed that we already are using it for, and we will probably have a higher need even for that. But there is also a ways to use it for material and energy. Some places there are stagnating yields for many reasons, and we also have a question about a large import of some products to Europe, mainly feed products, and I will say the word soya. Then on the other side of the coin, there's the environmental demands that we in Denmark are struggling a lot with the European Water Framework Directive. But also the new climate plans from Europe puts a heavy burden on agriculture, how to reduce total emissions by 39%. I think in Denmark is a very difficult task without reducing productivity. So I think it's time to look for radical innovation instead of the usual incremental innovation that we've been doing for centuries, and we are damn good at what we're doing, but I'm afraid we're doing the wrong thing. So if we look at what is the main crop in Denmark and many other places in Europe, wheat, it seems that we have reached kind of a ceiling of productivity. There was a great increase during the 1980s and 90s, but there's kind of a ceiling now. Of course, there will still be room for these 1 or 2% increases that we always put a lot of money in getting. But I think it's small things. Of course, there are other parts of the world. There's still a yield gap that might be filled, and of course you can work on that and have good outcome from that. But I think we have to look more basically at what we are having, what kind of physical resources we have and how we use them for photosynthesis. This is the basic process for everything it has been. Now I'd say for billions of years, Maybe that will change over time. We have new techniques that will maybe start competing with photosynthesis, and for direct energy production as power. Of course, it's much more efficient to use photovoltaic cells. But I think for chemical composition and also for materials, I think we still need some photosynthesis for many years from now. And there's a large room for improvement of the photosynthesis itself. And here's one of my PhD students screening different genotypes of miscanthus, a tall grass from East Asia, which is very productive already. It's a C4 photosynthesis crop. And also there we can find some improvements for use breeding, etc. But I think we forgot to look at our overall way to handle agriculture, because look at that picture taken in August with the best climate of the year, still good radiation, good temperature. Mostly we have water, not last year, but mostly we have water also at that time, and we should have a lot of productivity at that time, but most of Denmark looks like this. And then shortly after we will it will be plowed and we will often seed a winter seed, and then just before everything closes down in October, there's some small green seedlings coming up, and not much productivity in that part of the year. And this is what we could do better, because late autumn, our fields, our field plots here, looks very different from totally bare till still green and productive. And this is something we can choose. It's not a nature-given thing that agriculture has to look like the picture before. We just chose that path over the last 100 years. We had some small pots for the grains. Now we have some big pots for the grains. We're still doing the same thing, much more efficient, but we forgot to choose the right crops for what we should produce in the future for the bioeconomic society. I will take this short one also on another major issue for Denmark. I think often it looks like in Sweden you have a higher focus on phosphorus. We tend to think it's all about nitrogen. Anyway, we have to keep a good household of our nutrients as we can. And what we did before was most often to have a spring crop, spring barley, and nothing during the winter, and our sandy soils would be fully washed away from nitrate. As you can see, the red dots are the nitrate that goes down with the water, the surplus water we have in winter. Then we, second picture, have the winter crops, a slight improvement, but not always so good actually, to keep a better budget with the nitrate. Then we have started using a lot of catch crops. It's still just a kind of solution to a problem. It's not a final solution. The most efficient solution, and we use the Danish farmers use a lot of money to grow these catch crops, and they're not used for anything. They're just plowed under, and you could think that's good for the climate gases, but it's not necessarily, because there's a lot of nitrous oxide emissions when you plow under a catch crop. More efficient would be to have a perennial crop that has a growth over the year that matches the microbes in the soil, that releases the nitrate, and there will be very little nitrogen leaching. Most often you can do it like from natural areas, even it's an intensive crop, and that problem should be solved. I will show a few results from our experiment. As you saw the picture before from our field plots, we've done that experiment over quite some years now, and from our first publications we have 3 years of means here. I've selected some crops that maybe also engineers can understand. grass, maize, silage, grain crops, and crop rotation. The grain crops are monoculture, each year the same, and the maize is the same, each year maize. You can easily produce high yields from maize after maize after maize. But you can see the same field, same climate, everything is the same. But over the years, we have almost a factor of 2 between the highest yield and the lowest yield. And then the other side of the coin, the same crops, is totally different. What you can see is that maize is actually quite competitive on the productivity. It's also a C4 crop with an efficient photosynthesis. But when you look at the nitrate leaching, it loses the competition because it's very inefficient. We don't really understand why we can fertilize 160 and lose 100 kilograms of nitrogen from maize production, but that's what we often see. So this is actually the picture I wanted to end the show about, because now I gave the proof that we can double more or less productivity and half nitrate leaching. The other good things are that pesticide use is some 50 times lower in grass production than in a crop rotation in Denmark. And we build up soil carbon, something like half a ton of pure carbon per hectare per year on the grasslands, while the crop rotation usually reduce the content of carbon in our soils. So there are so many benefits. So the only problem we actually have, what the hell should we do with all of that grass? Because today farmers are producing the grass they need for the cows. So if we should change primary agricultural production into something else, we should create a market, and we should look into new biotechnological methods to improve our use of the whole system. My answer to that question would be that we should convert this grass in green biorefineries. You can decide yourself what green means, but here it's when it's grass, everything becomes green during the process. You can produce a lot of different products. We've chosen to focus on what we are good at in Denmark, food, feed and energy, the lower parts there, and then we expect that all of the higher value products could add to the business case later. I think that's a better way of doing it instead of starting at the top, which I think sometimes have been the strategy many places, that you start with all of the small materials that you can make to a high value, and then you don't get the bulk production up running. So we take the hard battle to try to make the basic production work. But we started, of course, looking for what it is that we should have the highest interest in. And what we think is really interesting is that grasses and clovers, of course, we also have to remember the legumes, which have some benefits with the nutrient supply for nitrogen. And they are also very rich in nitrogen, the legumes. But also grasses, when we fertilize them, they have a very high content of protein. So across many different crops, the white bars in the middle with 3 sub-bars, because the grass was harvested 3 times over a season, have a much higher content of crude protein per hectare than all of the other crops that were grown the same year on the same field. And you could, for example, compare to the maize, which was quite productive on biomass, but has quite a low content of protein. So at least a double content in the grasses. It's maybe not so easy to extract that protein. Some of it is fiber bound, and so we will have to see how the total yield of protein from a field will be. That's another question. So I'll show a few pictures from what we have started doing. We have a pilot facility at the Aarhus University in Foulum, in the middle of nowhere in the countryside, which means that we have good space for doing dirty work. And actually our engineering department that mainly have their activities in the city at campus, main campus, they actually like to come out there and get dirty and have a lot of space to make pilot scale things. Here we feed in the grass. It's we take in the grass whole, not cut. We try to not cut it in the field, because the moment you start cutting the grass, you start some processes with polyphenols that hampers the availability of the protein. But then we macerate the grass at the plant, and it comes into across 2 screw presses where we press green juice. That is then in this tank. We precipitate the protein from the juice either with acid, which could also be a fermentation process, so it's lactic acid, or with heat to heat it to 70 to 80 degrees, and then the protein is precipitated, and then it's centrifuged, and with also heat exchange, we can have a low energy use during the process. And then finally, here are the products and the happy engineer telling about it to the public. This is then with the nose. It's one of our main NGOs that are very interested in seeing how we could improve our agricultural footprints of all of many different in many different subjects, but also the industry and the farmers are really interested in seeing what's going on. And it's the grass juice there with dissolved protein, and then behind that there's a sticky paste with high content of protein, and that we can feed directly to animals, or we could dry it first and make it a marketable product. I have some in my bag. Sometimes I'm sending it around. You can all taste it. But last time I did it, one of our feeding experts said to me, "This is such a bad quality. It's from last year, and this year it's much better, and it tastes like shit. So don't use that anymore." And I don't have a new product. So if you're there, you can come to me and taste. I think it's quite good. It's like green tea, but it's okay. That's that the animals are quite happy about it. And now with the high content of protein this year, with 50% of protein in the product, it's competitive to soy. We've just finalized a full-scale feeding trial to growing finisher pigs, and there was no difference in productivity between those fed with soy and those fed totally the protein ration with green protein. And there was some intermediate also, of course, mixed, and there was no difference. And then there was a test show afterwards. People were invited for a test show, and everybody ate a lot of Danish pig meat. And there was a choice, and nobody could taste any difference, which most people thought was a success. I would have liked maybe that you could see this was a green product, so that maybe the fat will change the color a little bit. We have seen that with the poultry, that the meat or the fat gets yellower. Yeah. I don't know how much time I've got, because there's a very nice story about the milk production from the fiber fraction, but I think we can take that another day, because I need to show also that we are going now from pilot scale to demonstration, which will be very close to what we think is commercial scale, that you can discuss for a long time. But they need to be quite local, these green biorefineries, because we are transporting green grass with 80% of water, and transporting water is a bad business case. So they should have a transport distance with a maximum of maybe 10 kilometers. And therefore we expect to have maybe grass from 2,000 to 3,000 hectares for one biorefinery that will have an input capacity for this one of 10 to 20 tons of fresh grass per hour, and maybe this is half scale of what would be a final commercial scale. And they are building at the moment, and it should be ready for the grand opening in June, where we have a conference over 3 days on bioeconomy. And on the first day, which is for free for any visitors, we will have this grand opening of the new facility. So they are under some kind of pressure, our engineers. This is not so usual that a university goes into demonstration, but we have put so much energy and time and money into this development, and we think it's so full of prospects that we don't want to lose it in some in a shelf somewhere. We want to put it very close to the marketplace. And so far there's been so much interest, but no one really have taken over the challenge to be those that would produce it. It's quite difficult to make the new product chain because the farmers should produce something else than usually. There will be some logistics that are quite different. There will be someone to produce this green biorefinery and run it, and the first ones will certainly lose money. And then when they earn money, there will be they need to find some new ways of selling the product, and all of this has to compete with the conventional soy industry that has developed over many years. So it's a difficult task to set up the new business. We will not do that, but we will try to come quite close to that. And it's going to look like this. In the beginning, we have thought mainly about the feed things, but of course we also look into producing direct human food from this protein. We use a lot of soya protein also for direct human consumption. Why not produce it ourselves? Of course, biochemicals and materials, there's so many things when you start looking at. We have started looking into all of the components in different grasses and different legumes, many hundred different chemical compounds. We don't know yet which ones are the ones with a business case, but one thing is there's a lot of sugar, which I didn't know before, that grass should be that full of sugar. Sometimes the first cut can be 30% of sugar of total dry matter. And that at the moment is we put just into the biogas, but that's maybe a too low value to just produce biogas from pure sugar. So we try to see if we can make something better from that. There are many other things we need to improve over time, and one thing we are thinking about and also starting doing is that we should in the future harvest all of these local grasslands with the robots. They need to be harvested quite often in order to have young leaves full of protein. We don't know all of the details about this with harvest intervals and so on, but I'm sure this is how it should be done, because it should be then 24 hours delivery to the plant. So I will conclude that we can produce a better environment if we take the best of our knowledge from agriculture and combine it with the best of the knowledge from the industry, the bioindustry, and make a new future from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Uffe. So the big question movement will be later, but if anyone here has some burning questions that prevents you from even listening to Christel that comes afterwards, please. You have a few minutes while they shift. Yes, Mats, please.
We need that from the listener online. So I'll give you one here.
Thank you very much. Does this apply to organic agriculture as well? All this you've been talking about?
The best business case is for organic agriculture, because it's the engine of organic agriculture is grass clover, and many places we cannot produce enough grass clover for getting enough nitrogen for crop production in organic agriculture. So sometimes they just produce it and plow it under. They would much like a market for that. And then when we produce a protein concentrate, we have to substitute something with more than double price of conventional. The price of organic soy is more than double that of conventional soy, so that's a much better business case. At the moment, it seems to be already a good business case. The problem is only to find 2,000 hectares of organic land within a short distance. That's not so easy. It's still not a good business case with the current technology to make it for conventional products. So I'm quite sure the first demonstration plans will be, some of them at least, organic.
Okay, thank you for that question and that answer. Now we leave the floor to Christel Cederberg at Physical Resource Theory here at Chalmers. Please, Christel.
And you can hear me? No? Okay, now, thank you. Okay, I will continue here and take some extra here on soil quality and pesticides, and it's very much associated with what you have heard from Uffe. And so I will talk mostly about soils and pesticides in these systems. And we should actually remember that this soil carbon sequestration, that is to increase soil stocks, carbon soil stocks, in a way that is longer than for some years, is actually one of the negative emission technology nets that are now discussed on a global scale. And what this happens about is that we do have about 58% of carbon in the soil organic matter, and we want to increase that one, which means that we have to add more residues, and we have to see that we don't have too much decomposition of the soil organic matter. So that is about having a net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. And if we look at the latest estimations of different type of negative emission technologies, so on a global scale, you have around 3 to 4 gigaton CO2 per hectare, per year globally. And I just want to say that this is around the same range as what they estimate BECS to be at 2050. So it's important here. And we often talk so much about climate, but we should also remember this, that soil organic matter is so important for good soil quality in the long run. There are a number of different functions that are so important to have a good soil. When it comes to physical, this picture here, to the right, you have a soil that's from Kansas, where you have had grassland for 100 years. You can see you have a structure stability, a darker soil, much higher soil organic matter. And on the left, there is a soil that has been in typical American agriculture with monoculture with soy and maize for quite many years now. Much more compact and dead soil. And a normal year, and with fertilizer, you could very much have high yields from these soils. But when you look on a more resilient base, if you have dry or if you have much chemicals, it's very, very important to have these functions from both physical, biological, and chemical. In Sweden, we have a monitoring program of the soil in Sweden, and this is from cropland arable soils. And here you can see the content of soil organic matter in the soils. It's a bit firm, but the redder, the lower soil organic matter, and you can see down in Skåne, in the southwest of Skåne, we have the lowest, and a tendency to higher when we come up north, and that's very important due to a colder climate. And we can also see that in the west we have a bit higher because we have a wetter climate. Generally, I would say that on a global scale we have quite good quality of these soils. And this is based on what they actually do in the monitoring program. So this is how we have the knowledge we have about soils. In this farming, they do this soil sampling around every 50 years, so there is a lot of soils to follow up. And you can take out some
farm directions here. And I just picked up from that program from arable soils in Västra Götaland if there are on cattle farms, arable farms or pig farms. And this is generally all over. We have about 0.5% unit higher organic matter when we are on cattle farm. And the difference here between this farm direction, if we calculate that from topsoil, is around 12 ton carbon per hectare in the carbon stock, which is due to the different farm directions. And the big explanation for this is the typical crop distribution. So on cattle farms we have grassland, or what we say ley, with different years in Sweden and in Denmark. Typically 60-65% of the land on a arable land on a cattle farm is in grassland, and then there are some grain, maybe legumes. While if we have a typical arable land farm, we have cereals, grain, winter wheat, spring barley, probably some rapeseed and maybe some legumes, but it's annual crops. And this is the big explanation for the differences in carbon stock that you build up after some years. And I think one important, we talk so much about the biomass above, the production of biomass from crops, and that is what we calculate because the farmer gets paid for that. But one reason for the grassland of being such a good soil carbon sequestration crop is that we have quite a lot of the carbon that is going down into the roots. So you give also the soil and all the ecosystems here, biomass for building carbon and soil organic matter. Just finally here, this is an estimate that the researchers at SLU in Uppsala has done for the National Board of Agriculture in Sweden, just to give some numbers on which measures, if we want to have measures in the CAP program for increasing soil carbon sequestration. And basically you can see here grasslands, salix and catch crops, just as Uffe described, where you could say it's a kind of a very short grassland between two green crops, so it's like trying to mimic. And here we know also, as Uffe said, we can actually have some problems with more nitrous oxide, so this is just the carbon. And please see here, we talked so much about having a no-tillage system as a way of not having so much decomposition of carbon, but actually more and more studies show that this is actually not so efficient. Now I will go into pesticides, and I want to say that if I want you to remember one thing of this is that the data gaps and the knowledge about use, risks, effects are so very low. If we compare for the climate and carbon and methane and all these where we have talked and have so much research, pesticides in food production is really sometimes a black area, I would say. Especially in the developing countries, and this is very serious because there are now so much food production increasing in these countries, and there is a lot of problem associated. Pesticides is basically a chemical, a toxic chemical that we spread in an ecosystem. And this is just to show the complexity in how it can transport and break down. So it's very, very local, the effects. And basically we can have spray drift, which goes into rivers. We can have leaching of pesticides. We can have wind erosion, and depending on what type of chemical it is, how volatile it is, we can have this can be stronger or less stronger. Just if we look at the impacts, I would say if we start with this, especially developing countries, with this risk and effects from handling and use, I just wanted to show you these pictures. This is actually taken by, I was at a visit in Brazil some years ago and took this picture. My colleague Christian Assar, who was in Indonesia, he took this picture, and the working environment are completely terrible. But I would say, because I was born on a farm, and my father, he was young in the 40s and 50s, and then our farmers worked very much like this. And I would really say that there are a lot of old farmers who started with pesticides in Sweden in the 40s and 50s that are really short in life because of the way of handling. I would then also like to say that this here is not typical for Brazilian soybean, because it's very high-tech, everything, mostly. But you can still see these things. And we have recently finished the work where we have looked at the PRINCE project with the Swedish EPA financed, where we tried to look at the impact of Swedish consumption, including all type of imports, so it was totally. And then we had pesticides also included, and especially when it came to fungicides and insecticides, we could see how massive the use was in developing countries for delivering the food, all the food that we buy in. So this is really, really very much the thing. I would also say, Uffe just told me they have this big debate now in Denmark, because they have the Uppdrag granskning in Denmark is looking at the soy import from Argentina, where they actually can see out in the countryside how they use pesticides in the soy, and they actually have a lot of effects on people living in the countryside, not the farmers, not the person handling, but actually people living there. So I think this is a very, very neglected impact that we have talked far too little about. But we talk more on us. We can talk about pesticide residues. That is mostly what we talk about, what we can have in food. But also the contamination of groundwater and surface water, which is actually quite important in parts of Europe. And then we have this toxicity on ecosystems. We can have direct, because if we want to kill an insect, we spray an insecticide, we are quite sure we will kill other non-target insects also. And then also these indirect effects by we change the feed sources. For example, if we spray away a lot of the weeds, we will of course change the feed sources, which is a more diffuse way of it. And this review came just 2 months ago, where some researchers have really tried to find studies that had a long-term overview of how insects are changing over time. And here is also one data gap. They looked really, and I only find 73 for the whole world, 73 reviews, where they historically from the 30s, 40s could follow how is the trend for the number of insects, both total numbers but also species. And as insects are so important for almost any ecosystem functions and services, you could say we don't have a record of this enough. However, based on these 73 historical reports, they went to National History Museum, etc., and tried to get a cope of what type of insects could you find in 1910s, 20s, etc. So it was really a detective work here. And what we can see from this here is different taxa, different families. We can see that there is almost half of the insect species are rapidly declining, and a third is threatened by extinction. And they also really try to understand the causes, which factors are associated with these declines. So how is the biodiversity, insect biodiversity losses, drivers for that? And we tend today to talk so much about the biodiversity losses due to deforestation in the tropics, but actually we also have a large biodiversity impact here in the Western world, because most of these studies were in the Western world. And we can here see that this very intensive agriculture with pesticides are the main drivers here, actually, based on this. Yeah. That is invasive species. Yeah. What do
they mean by ecological traits?
Ecological traits, that is, for example, that the bee community gets sick. So you get sickness, and also that you have invasive species. So, and finally, the current pesticide use. We have also an increasing problem because we have a very large use of pesticides. It's the easy solution. And similar to antibiotics use with resistance, we have the same thing with our pesticides. We have problems both for weeds, fungus and insects with increasing resistance. And as it's very, very difficult now to develop new pesticides, this could be actually be a risk for future when we need these products. LCA, which measures the impact of products and food, it's used very much for food. They have the same problem as everyone else in this society. They seem to neglect pesticides very much. If we look at a lot of food systems studies, and you see which impacts are including, it's quite often that you don't include the effects of pesticides. So we get an incomplete picture. This is a study that we did just some years ago, where we used the newest methods and trying to look at the ecotoxicity impacts from pesticide use. And I will just show you what's the problem here. We have use of pesticides, which means that we will have emissions. We don't have any databases of emissions all around the world, so this we have to model in some way. And then for each of these different substances, we should have some type of characterization factor used with the LCA language or impact indicator, so we can see how strong, how toxic is this emission. And finally, so we can get one final metric, which for this system called USTEX is called comparative toxic unit. And all these are based on estimate of how many species in a given water volume will be affected. So we did this for a study where we looked at 6 different food products: bread, peas, minced pork, köttfärs, milk, köttfärs och nöt, and chicken fillet. And we used data and emission. We calculated emission based on the circumstance for Västra Götaland, where all these crops are grown, and also for soybeans, which were imported from Brazil, which is the normal here in Sweden. So you have to get this data, which type of pesticide, how often is it used, then you have to have some idea about how it's applied, etc., and when in the year to calculate. This is peas in Sweden. This is standard pesticide use in soybeans, Brazil, and this is how it is. I have been there and studied it, so I feel sure about this inventory. And the results became as follows. So here we looked at these 6 different food, and we calculated comparative this toxic unit per functional unit, and we used different type of functional units. So we compared the foods by megacalorie, kilo food, kilo protein, and some different proteins, just to be sure that depending on what type of reference unit were used, that the result didn't differ. And we put chicken fillet to 1.0, so we compare everything. And you can see here that pig and pork is the far way highest. And then comes beef and milk, and the vegetable alternatives are less. And why is pork and chicken worse than beef and milk? And here we can see the comparative toxic unit calculated per crop, per kilo crop. We can see how high the soybean goes away, and we can also see that the insecticides are very important here. And it is like this also, that insecticide residues that comes to water, aquatic systems, they are very toxic. Many of them are very toxic for the living species in aquatic system. And you can also see here what the large part that the soy is here from these different feed components. So if we go back to what Uffe talked about, the way of trying to replace this soybean crop that is imported from either Brazil or Argentina would actually have a great impact on the overall food products potential environmental impact when it comes to pesticide. And this is just how it looks for Sweden. The import of soybean is today about 210,000 tons of soy. And what has happened for the last year is that poultry use of soy meal has increased a lot. One part is that we produce more chicken, but it's also that soy is the more and more overall standard here. So the potential of exchanging some of this would really improve the profile of chicken meat. So again, we need innovative solutions to change food systems. And I just want to say that there are interesting things happening, but this is just an example of how we could take away chemicals for weed in cereals. But again, it costs money, and this is quite a small firm that has started this. There's a big economic interest in selling all these chemicals. And now this grass-based biorefinery, where we have this project now with Denmark, have been a bit before, but where we now are also building a test pilot in Västra Götaland in Sötåsens Naturbruksgymnasium, where we have this very interesting of using a very beneficial biomass and through modern technology use it for different purposes. And what we are not doing now, the coming year here, is really to understand the whole system here. This is really to, from the local conditions, understand how can we best make this whole system to replace bad products and create a very good biomass production. Thank you.
Thank you, Christel. Again, while we shift the speaker here, if there are any urgent question or clarification. Yes, please.
It's just sequestering carbon in the soil. Let's say that we did all we could and put as much soil, as much carbon as we could into the soil. Oh. Yeah. Okay, yeah. But how many years of fossil carbon output would that offset? I mean, there's a limit to how much we can put in there, and how many. And it's just because we did a study in Denmark a while ago, and if we just stored everything we could in the Danish forest, it would be like 4 years we could offset of fossil emissions.
Yeah, I don't have an answer on that, and the bad thing about that we will have a saturation coming. Although there is quite a big debate when that saturation will be. I don't think you hear me now, do you? Yeah, I'm here. But I think that is one of the very important research questions we really need to understand. But if we look, for example, Oskar will show you some pictures now where he could have some type of speculation on that. But if we look at these soils that have lost a lot of carbon, like in Skåne, and you will see Denmark and great part of England, there would be a very, very high potential for carbon sequestration. But you have to be very specific where to do it. I think we can have this discussion later.
Okay, thanks, Christel. So the third presenter now, Oskar Englund, Chalmers, one of Chalmers' recent exports to the world, who saves the world elsewhere now, but also still employed here at Chalmers. Now we will broaden the perspective a bit, so extending from Denmark, Sweden to looking at Europe, and also looking at other aspects of introducing lignocellulosics in the agricultural landscape, you can say. I also got some really good news for everyone here, and that is as soon as Oskar has finished speaking, you will have a coffee. So before going to the questioning session, we take a few minutes break and you can get coffee outside. But first, Oskar, and take your time, no problem.
Ooh. And I was about to make a rare attempt of being brief. Thank you, Göran, and thank you also for the good news about the coffee. Yes, I will, as Göran said, broaden the perspective a little bit, talk about Europe and more aspects of this. And this is a recent research project that we have been doing at Chalmers in collaboration with also Lund University and SLU. And the European Commission's Joint Research Centre in Europe and other partners. And if I just can recap a little bit the challenges that we'll be talking about today. We have indeed a challenge of that the current land use systems in many cases are unsustainable. It's the intensive production of annual crops and also the use of pesticides, as Christel talked about just now, can degrade biodiversity and the conditions for a multitude of ecosystem services. And this manifests itself with environmental impacts. We've talked about soil carbon losses, and we have also talked about nitrate leaching. Recurring floods is also a common environmental impact from an unsustainable land use, as well as soil losses by water and wind erosion. So one important challenge for society is how to meet our how to continue to produce biomass, but still decrease its environmental impacts. And then we have the other challenge that Jørgen introduced this session with, that we actually need more biomass. Virtually all scenarios towards meeting our climate targets in the long term needs more biomass than can be met with only residues. So we need, of course, increased resource use efficiency, but also new biomass production. So how to increase primary biomass production to meet the future biomass demands is the second challenge that we've been talking about. And these may seem incompatible, but we have seen some examples here today that they are indeed not. And I will add some more examples to this. But what is, I think, important to highlight here is that what is needed to uphold or increase the biomass production while also enhancing the conditions for biodiversity and ecosystem services is land use change. And land use change has been commonly referred to as something negative by default. It refers to the conversion of natural ecosystems. But that is, of course, not positive, but land use change is needed to meet these challenges that we've been talking about today. And that type of land use change we refer to as beneficial land use change. And a specific term that I would like to plant with you here now is strategic perennialization, where we in a strategic way introduce perennial crops into intensively managed agricultural landscapes to mitigate environmental impacts from current land use while producing biomass, including nutrient emissions to water, wind and water erosion, losses of soil organic carbon, recurring floods, etc. And of course, this type of land use change, if this provides benefits for society, these benefits could be, the landowners can be credited for these benefits to compensate for the implementation costs. So a few further examples of strategic perennialization. Here we have good old-fashioned windbreaks. So this is just a landscape where it's really windy and the soil may be sandy. So the wind erosion is high. So you establish these windbreaks with tree species that protects the cropland in between. And by doing this, you take some cropland. You need to convert some cropland into tree plantations, but the yield effect in the cropland in between the rows, it increases the yields. It can increase the yield. So the net yield in the landscape may not be affected at all. And if we use the right species, we can harvest the biomass and get an additional biomass source. Another example is riparian buffer zones. Here is a cropland, and we have a watercourse, and they can be by establishing, in this case, willow, energy forest, or grasses. We can catch agrochemicals from ending up in the watercourse, especially nutrients. And again, I mean, many of these buffer zones exist. It's even demanded by legislation in many countries. But most often it's not harvested, it's just left there. By actually having harvestable or productive production systems as buffer zones, we can extract the biomass, make use of it, and it also increases the efficiency of the buffer zone. If you just have a vegetation that you leave there, it will eventually end up as a nutrient source. But by harvesting it, you also remove the nutrients. And as we have been talked about extensively today, we can also convert cereal production or annual crop production into grass production with substantial environmental benefits. So, the research project that I will show some results from today is we try to explore the options and the potential for these types of strategic penalization at EU level. So we look at each of the about 81,000 sub-watersheds that we have in Europe and try to map and quantify what is the degree of different environmental impacts in these individual watersheds, and how effective would it be to strategically introduce perennials in these watersheds to mitigate these impacts. And just some very brief on methods. The degree of current environmental impacts was estimated by using spatial indicators with quite high spatial resolution, 50-meter spatial resolution, and then we aggregated it to a value for the entire landscape. And for the mitigation effectiveness, we combined the degree of environmental impact with the theory on how perennialization how effective that would be in mitigating the impact, as well as the density of annual crops in the landscape. And I will get back to this on the next slide, what that means. So for each landscape, we classified it for the degree of current environmental impact from very low to very high. And we used the same classification for mitigation effectiveness. So here we have the annual crop density in Europe. And this means annual crop density is the share of the total vegetated area in each specific landscape that is annual crops. It's used for annual crop production. And we see that we have some areas where we have a very high. Here we have the legend, get used to it. We're going to see it for a while now. In some areas, all of Denmark basically has a very high annual crop density. Yeah, congratulations. You have plenty of opportunities in Denmark. The Po Valley in Italy as well, and the whole Danube region, northern France, eastern UK, yeah, Germany, Poland, and some areas also in Spain. And the reason why we're interested in this is because it does not make very good sense to introduce perennials into a landscape where there is already a lot of perennials. So this is one fundamental assumption, that it must be a pretty high density of annual crops in the landscape for strategic perennialization to be an effective option. So we first take a look at soil loss by water and wind erosion combined. At your left, we have the degree of the current impact. So here we have, again, the same legend, from very low to very high. And soil loss by wind and water erosion, this almost exclusively refers to water erosion, soil loss by water erosion. Wind erosion is only a problem on about 1%, affects only 1% of annual crop production in Europe, particularly on the Danish coast, a little bit in Sweden, and also here we have the Netherlands and also a bit in the UK, where it's windy. In the rest of Europe, it's more water erosion. And when it comes to the effectiveness of strategic perennialization, where we also take the annual crop density in particularly into consideration, we see that the most problematic areas is Italy southeastern Europe and Spain and northern Portugal. But we can also see that we have a high to very high mitigation effectiveness in large areas, and also eastern UK, northern France, and Denmark, and also in Germany and Poland. And we continue to look at nitrogen emissions to water, which is the second category. And this is particularly problematic in northwestern Europe, but also some areas in Central Europe. If we instead take a look at the effectiveness of strategic penalization, we see that some more areas open up in especially France and Poland. What's also quite interesting, I think, is that we have a very high degree of nitrogen emissions to water in Ireland. And that is primarily because of high precipitation and also a lot of animal production. But it's basically almost grass. The entire island is grass. It wouldn't make that much sense introducing a lot more grass there. So the mitigation effectiveness is quite small. Recurring floods is problematic throughout Europe, especially Central Europe, around the major rivers. And the effectiveness is the main problem is, of course, the Po Valley in Italy and the Danube region, which is also seen here in the effectiveness. We see good prospects in the Po Valley and in the Danube region, but also in eastern UK, large parts of Spain, France, Germany and Poland. And finally, what Christel talked about earlier about accumulated losses of soil organic carbon. That is problematic throughout Europe, with a high spatial correlation with the production of annual crops. So we see the same also for the mitigation effectiveness, that it's we see that it would be quite effective to mitigate the accumulated losses of soil organic carbon just by strategically introducing perennial crops into the landscape. And if we try to quantify these nice maps a little bit, we see that the share of the total area of annual crop production in Europe, located in landscapes where accumulated soil organic carbon losses is high or very high, is 70%. This means that 70% of the total area of annual crop production in Europe is located in landscapes where soil organic carbon losses are high or very high. This is a very high number. And we also it's similarly high for the effectiveness, that 2/3 of the area of annual crop production in Europe is located in landscapes where the effectiveness in mitigating soil organic carbon losses by strategically introducing perennial crops is high or very high. For recurring floods, affects 14% of the area under annual crops, and similar numbers for the effectiveness. Water erosion 12%, and wind erosion, as I said, affects 1% of the annual crop production in Europe. But combined, a quarter of the annual crop production in Europe can be subject to strategic penalization with very high effectiveness when it comes to mitigating total erosion. For nitrogen emissions to water, it's high or very high, 11% of the area under annual crops. Similarly for the mitigation effectiveness. So, knowing this, we can think a little bit about, okay, 2/3 of the area under annual crop production can be subject to strategic penalization for mitigating accumulated soil organic carbon losses. That's a lot. So where should we start? We should start where it will have the highest environmental benefits. And this is what we have tried to map here. Priority areas for strategic penalization refers to either the yellow or orangey areas, which is where one impact can be mitigated with a very high effectiveness by introducing perennials strategically. Or the various shades of blue, which is where multiple impacts can be mitigated simultaneously with either high or very high effectiveness. And then we see some notable, the first thing we see is that we have priority areas scattered all over Europe, but we have some notable hotspots. Again, Denmark is an entire hotspot for strategic penalization, and as well as the Po Valley in Italy. We also see Western UK, Northern France, and large parts of Eastern Europe as well, and the whole Danube region. Large parts of Italy outside the Po Valley, as well as both northern, central, and southern Spain, and Germany and Poland. So maybe I just highlighted that it's scattered across Europe here. Maybe I should have limited this. Anyways, so depending on how we define the priority areas, they can be priority areas can constitute between 15 to 60 million hectares throughout Europe, affecting between 10 and almost up to half of the total area under annual crops, depending on how you define priority areas. So the current status of this research is it's under peer review, but there is a preprint available if you're interested in reading more about this, where also the methods are described in detail, and you have the link to that preprint here, and I assume this will be distributed online, this presentation afterwards. We also have an extension of this analytical framework that is ongoing, because currently we can say that we can provide information on the effectiveness of unspecified perennial production systems for strategic penalization. We are interested in knowing where and how specific types of production systems could work. And this refers to, as I talked about earlier, riparian buffer strips or contour strips following contour lines in the landscape, windbreaks, or crop shifts. And the output of this extended analytical framework will be, of course, the total area of these different penalization options that can be used to mitigate individual or multiple impacts with varying degrees of effectiveness. The corresponding biomass outputs, because this can be seen as some sort of you can consider this to be, you can think about this as something very marginal, but if you implement this on a large scale, the actual biomass amounts that can be harvested from these systems can be quite substantial. And I have been told to wrap up, so I'm going to do that. But it's also, no, I'm going to skip that. So I wasn't so brief as I thought I was going to be.
No. Thank you, Oskar. And you ended perfectly with a cliffhanger and linking to future research. That's what we love. So let's take a short break now, a few minutes, and then we gather here again for discussions. Please.
Super quick.
Yes, so now we have the questioning, not hour, but session, at least half an hour. We have Maria, who will run with a mic. And possibly if there are questions coming from the net, we have also someone reading there. We have Anders that is waving a lot. I'm not sure if you have a question or if you want to help me informing about anything.
I have a question.
He has a question. So let's start with Anders in this session.
I have a question about economy. I guess when shifting from this kind of traditional agriculture into these kind of new ideas, you produce a lot of positive externalities that is not internalized in the economy. Could you comment on that? What would be needed for this to happen? Because I guess there is, since they're not included in the economy, it can be pretty hard like it is now.
Shall I start? And I know that Uffe will go on here, and maybe Oskar also. I think it's very true that that some money would help. And for example, in a Swedish agricultural policy, we have these environmental subsidies. We have you can have a subsidy if you grow grassland, which is 500 kronor per hectare a year, and that is quite helpful. And I think that is why has grassland increased a bit in Sweden? Because that makes grassland more competitive towards using cereals for feeding the animal. And then we have seen in the latest environmental program that we actually now have building up soil organic stocks in Sweden in mineral soils, and that's actually due to increased grassland. So we have shifted some of the cereals in earlier feed regimes into grass instead, which you can do for cattle. So in this next perspective, that is to help this with 500 kronor, maybe you could double it, because you will have other benefits like carbon stock, nutrient leaching, etc. And I think we need to be much more specified. Interestingly enough, is that Denmark has not these extra subsidies, and I know by calculation that what would happen if you would have 500 kronor per hectare. What would you say? Just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important question you raise because it's a major malfunction of our capitalistic system if it should also include or try to move us towards a better globe. That all of the environmental impacts that we more or less agree that we should reduce are not internalized in the economy. We're trying to do that on energy with carbon credits. I don't see why we don't do it also in agriculture. Nitrate leaching is something that we can internalize in Denmark, and we made a study around the Limfjord, which is the thing that cuts the top of Jutland, where we have major eutrophication problems, and much land have to be set aside, probably, if we don't find smarter solutions. Even though the organic scenario for producing biorefineries was positive. Also, if we looked at the conventional scenario, it was not more costly than the other measures that we are already using for reducing nitrate leaching costs, like catch crops, etc. It's something between 0 and 100 kroner per hectare. Now I don't remember the scale actually, but it's something that is just maybe more cheap than something else. But we still need to find a better solution in how to trade with this.
First, I have to say that I think it makes perfect sense that if you provide benefits for society, that you should receive some sort of compensation for that. That is not very controversial. So the question is just how to realize that. And but there is other incentives. For example, in the common agricultural policy, if you want to have support, agricultural support, you need to have, and you have a farm above a certain size, then you need to have what is called ecological focus areas, which is should be, I think, 5% of the total farm cropland area on a farm. And the purpose of these ecological focus areas is to protect biodiversity and enhance ecosystem services. And these can be designed so that they can be harvested as well. So if you have a farm and you would like to support, you need to have ecological focus areas. And instead of just taking some space behind your barn and leaving it be, you can choose where in the landscape that these ecological focus areas would make the most, would have the highest environmental benefits. And that is, I think, a rather interesting prospect.
But that is not how it's done today. We don't have that target. Farmers don't know where it would be. So we need to be better on strategic, put them in the right places.
Yes, okay. Klaus, please.
Yeah, this is mainly a question for all of you, actually. You solve it all, we've got perennials all over, but there's what I call the 1 alpha, 1 beta question, that cellulose is a major component in the perennials, and we need a lot of starch. So how do you solve that? Let's say you want to put perennials all over. Do you want to develop perennial wheat, or what is the solution to that? Because we have a need for starch, big time.
Yeah, I totally agree. In the beginning, I see no problem because we just for Denmark we export grain, and we could, on the other hand, easily import some grain if that's needed. But I think apart from using the grass fiber after extracting the protein as a better cattle feed, which we have shown that it's better than the grass was, then we should start looking at degrading the fiber into sugars, or I don't know, it should not necessarily be starch, it could also be some kind of sugars or easily degradable cellulose that we could use for monogastric animals. But that's still something we haven't looked into, and I think is an important area for further development.
But giving our global need for grain, that's probably not going to change that much. What is then the upper limit of perennialization of agriculture? We still need to make grain, unless we find a way of twisting cellulose and turn into starch.
Yeah, but I think I would never argue that we should have grass all over in Denmark, and I sometimes start when it's farmers to tell them I'm talking about maybe shifting 10% of the current land use. Then we would solve most of our nitrate leaching problems if we did that strategically. And I don't see that that's a major change in our total feed system. We change some soy with some grain. I agree, and then we should start working on how to use the fibers. The thing is that if we double productivity, we have a larger cake to share. For that purpose and also other purposes. And I'm sure we will find out how to also use some of the fibers or the sugars as feedstock.
If you take the Swedish instead of Denmark, which is such a big animal producer and have a great demand, I will remind you that around 20% of the grain in Sweden is today going into ethanol production. So there is this one, and you can say how sustainable is that land use in the long run. And what would happen if we look at the plains in Skåne and in Västergötland and in Östergötland, where we have this very, very much monoculture of cereal, what actually happens is not that we are going to put grass on everything, but we put grass in a smart way in a crop rotation. You will actually increase the yields and release the burden of pesticides in the environment. And we must remember, by doing this concept of grass-based biorefiner, we will not have to import so much protein to Europe, so that would free land in South America. So looking at this, you have to look at the whole picture here. Both possibility to increase yields due to better crop rotations in here, and free up land in South America. Whether that should be for maize or any other, that's another thing here. But
a comment and then a question. I mean, first, the grain to ethanol is actually a great example of better land use because you produce a lot of protein, and 1 hectare of grain to ethanol replaces 1 hectare of soy. So I mean that's not a solution to the protein question. But I think the big question here is: do we need new crops? Can we do it? I mean, we can do a little some manipulation as we have here, but in order to solve the big issue of 10 million people, reducing our footprint and all that, can we do it with the crops that we've got? Or do we need a perennial weed, or what's needed if you sort of try to look ahead?
Sure. We've just is I on? Sure. We haven't been breeding for that. We've been breeding for all of the old-fashioned purposes. So it's time to start. And for example, to breed for extractable protein in the grasses and not feed value. And it will take a lot of time, shorter than before because we have new methods, but surely. And the grasses we produce today could be more productive, and we should find out the best composition with legumes and so on. There's so much to do, and I also think that the questions that you raise, we need some bigger scenarios to answer that well. Some scenarios that include the globe, or at least larger regions, how we support our current systems with new systems, because there are some knowledge gaps that we still don't exactly know how to fill in. And then the economy of it all. There are so many things we need to be better at, and one of them only is that we should start developing new crops. But I don't think we need to have these new alien crops. We could just improve our current crops in another direction.
I just want to remind everyone online that we still have the possibility to send in questions, and that if you want to send in a question, you send it in an email to energy@chalmers.se. So please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate, send them, and we will read them up here. So just ask also if any questions has come in so far, Anki? No, nothing so far. So please, we have some 20 more minutes for you to join, and we have a question over here.
I talked to Christel in the pause, and I wonder why we don't discuss our diet, our meat and milk diet that is necessary, that we change all over the world, so to say, even in Europe, and especially in Sweden and in Denmark, where we eat 82 kilos meat per person a year. And if we lower that to what is recommended, around 20 kilos per year, so what will happen in this aspect, with this aspect?
Yeah,
land use. Yeah.
Of course, if we need to supply 10 billion people with increasingly affluent people with all the food and biomaterials and energy that we're going to need, it may be a good idea to be a little bit more resource efficient. And one obvious way of being that is to think about what we eat. So dietary changes can have, of course, massive effects on the availability of land use when it comes to producing biomass for other purposes.
Yeah, and of course now we are talking about production here and changing production, but also it comes with consumption. And just to talk about these cereals grown in mostly grain in Europe, I think around 60% of the grain produced in Europe goes for feeding animals, mostly pigs and chickens. So depending on how big our diet, that will obviously have an enormous influence here.
80%.
No.
It's in Denmark. It's 73% that is fed, and it's 2 to 3% that is directly. I don't know it in Sweden.
Know. In Sweden, it's like I think it's 40 to 45% of our cereal consumption, because we have actually taken down, but we import a lot, so we have a lot. I mean, we have for some species quite a high meat import. It's very different from Denmark and Sweden. We are very different countries in this aspect.
Thank you for your skills, and this is not my area of advance. I'm a construction engineer, so I'm used to build roads, buildings and bridges. But as a grandfather, I'm interested in this. I know that the SLU, the Swedish University for Agriculture domain, made examinations for the grain, the crops that we used in 1940 to produce bread. And 2010, there were only 30% of the protein content from 1940 in the grains. The farmers have increased the weight of the product to get more pay, but the quality of the grain is so much less. Do we really need to innovate the wheel again? Why don't we, as the former speaker said, get back to business the old way?
Now, this is what I should have in my head, but there are obviously a lot of... They really try to understand how the nutrients, etc., has developed over time. And no, I don't have this in my head. But I can say like this, that the breeding, for example, wheat is the king or queen crop of Europe. It's actually grown a lot, and it's the largest cereal all over the world. And what has been emphasized very much over the last 20 years, that is very high yielding varieties. And you use these wheat for both for starch and for ethanol, but also for bread where you want higher. And the problem is here that when you get these very high yields, you have to follow up with very high nitrogen fertilizers. And my thinking is that you want to be very efficient per hectare, but I know that organic farmers try to go back to older varieties. Maybe they use the mineralized nitrogen a bit better, so over time, but on the other hand, they can have very low yields. So this is really a trade-off going here. And when it comes to nitrogen, I mean, that is a protein, basically, and we don't have a protein loss. We eat too much protein, so I don't think that is actually the worry. Actually, I would say that the worry is maybe the micronutrients, which I am not updated to in my head.
We need to feed the world. I'm not talking about Sweden.
No.
They need protein in the world.
Yes, they do.
No doubt about that.
Yeah, but yeah.
And when it comes to feeding the world, there is maybe a point in using our modern varieties that are extremely high yielding, even though they don't taste as good as they did once upon a time.
Then I would like to add a question myself before I hand over to the next one. And you have touched upon it now, and we see, of course, a lot of different conflicts in goals, or there could be any conflicts in goals. So probably you are used to meet those questions about should we optimize towards the biodiversity or the protein or the nutrition or the climate goals or the acidification goals or so many different goals. Are there any trade-offs that you are usually get questions about, and how do you usually respond to them?
I think this presentation from Oskar is very good because he collects different trade-offs in the same analysis. But one question that often comes up is, of course, what about biodiversity on the agricultural land? And it's really a dilemma. If we cannot make red-listed areas for red-listed species on agricultural land without at least losing a lot of productivity. So my answer to that would be that we should have areas with intensive production without any emissions that harms the areas around, and then nature should mainly be in areas outside of the agricultural areas. Of course, also there could be more species in a perennial grass than in an annual wheatland, but this is marginal differences, and for few species, of course, like earthworms are much more common in perennial grass than in a wheat field. But I think we should separate that more or less. But that's open for debate.
Yeah, I don't agree with Uffe here. What Uffe is talking about is this land-sparing theory, to have some intense and then nature. And I tend to go more and more towards the land sharing, that we need to have all the ecosystem services in landscape. And I think this is one of the absolutely most difficult and important research questions. So I wouldn't say can we do trade-offs, but I think the biodiversity impacts now are so severe that we really have to work a lot with them, because they are so crucial for ecosystem services and functions.
Considering trade-offs, I mean, what you choose to do with a piece of land will have different effects, and how you value these different effects can differ quite a lot from person to person. And in the end, I think it's up to science to show what the effects would be of different options, and then it's up to policy to deal with these trade-offs. So trade-offs is a political problem. We can only highlight conditions.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting seminar. It's very interesting. I have a question. I mean, I'm completely non-expert in this field, but you talk about grass and grains. What about forests? I mean, would it? Increasing the amount of forest in order to capture carbon dioxide in timber? I mean, should we have more forests on the earth and make timber?
Forest is very good at capturing carbon and storing carbon, but it's not so good at, for example, delivering protein. So it depends on what do we want to use the biomass for. But of course, if we want to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, then afforestation is a very good option, as well as trying to increase the carbon stock in the soil, as Christel talked about earlier.
Yeah, well, here we have a real trade-off, and that is that we are going to be 10 billion people to feed. So, I mean, if we are going to have large plantation of forest for only capturing, then we have to discuss how we will do with food security. So that is real trade-off.
So then I just double check also online. Have we got any questions? Anki? No, nothing so far. You still have 5 more minutes to send in your questions if you are looking online.
I have one question to Uffe. I saw these companies that were investing in your demo plant, or at least they were kind of, you listed Arla and Danish Crown and so on. Can you describe a little bit the kind of the formation of these different big players in relation to these new opportunities that you have presented?
Yeah, I think I shortly touched upon it, that there's a large interest in this development, so that also these big companies are investing small pieces in what we are developing. And then we have, I think, at the moment, a lack of someone who will take it into their business to be the owners of that new technology, which is still not fully developed. I think that will happen over a few years. This current debate on soy impacts from what we import in Denmark, I think, will have some effects, and then there's also a new network being formed from what's called the Danish Agricultural Society, which are something between all of the Danish farm businesses, a Danish protein innovation network, which takes not only grass clover but also starfish and mussels and horse beans into consideration. But there's a lot of activities that pushes on in the right direction.
So where are the biggest competitors? Are you the only one in the world doing this now, or you see this happening in some other places?
This is not a new development. It started many years ago, and there was a lot of research in the 1960s and 70s There's been research other places in the world of trying to extract green protein from different kinds of leaves. I think this is only interesting if we can internalize these many environmental effects that was discussed earlier into one business case. Because it was another time in the 1960s, 70s, oil prices were different. We didn't consider any footprints we had, and suddenly there was a lot of cheap soy that we could import. So certainly there was no business case at that point of time. I think the world is different now, but that we have to prove.
I just thought of something when you said that this technology is not new, and in fact, a lot of what we're talking about today is not. It's certainly something new.
It's not rocket science in that.
No, I mean producing grass on agricultural fields to maintain soil fertility, or establishing windbreaks to stop wind erosion. That has been done for many hundreds of years. And so basically what we're doing now is going back to basic.
But putting the pieces together, I think, is quite an important area of work that we should have. And then also optimize the whole system in a new way, which is maybe rocket science, but we haven't really started that yet.
Yeah, just a simple question about the management of the grasslands. Do they need any tilling at regular intervals, or can you just leave them?
It's a big question. If you just leave them, yields will decrease over years. So the usual thing which is done in Danish agriculture is to plow them under after 2 or 3 years and then establish a new one, another place. And that doesn't have a lot of effect, especially not on nitrate leaching, because the next 100 years after a grass field, you will have a tail of increased nitrate leaching. So we estimate that the good 2 years are eaten up by the next 100 years of higher leaching. So it should be a more kind of permanent grassland, and that's a little bit hard to discuss with the farmers. We think that we could turn them over every 4 or 5 years and then establish a new grassland in a grain crop, a lay crop. And so but there are many things there that we need to optimize in a good way that is also practical for the farmer and good for the environment and so on.
Yes, so time is coming scarce here, and that means that the last few moments for asking questions, soon you will need to pay for these. This is the last one that is for free, actually, but then you will need to pay. So we'll start the bidding now.
Yes. Thank you. I have a short question that is basically kind of egoistic. You're talking about soybeans and mainly for the meat production, and then a lot of people want to eat good, so then we eat soy instead, like lunch today, I think, which is not, there's pesticides and there's a lot of problems with that. So can we connect that with what we're going to grow that makes something that's kind of meat substitute? Can we have peas? Would that be a good crop to change what we have? Can you sort of combine those two issues?
Yeah, I can start. There are many good things about peas and horse beans, and that you don't go through an animal first saves a lot of energy. So that's good for the climate, probably. Well, it's good for crop rotation, but for nitrate leaching, peas are awful. They are some of the worst ones. That gives a lot of nitrate leaching after in the following winter if you're not very, very careful with catch crops and so on, and horse beans the same. So there's no free lunch, no easy solution, and that's why we would also really love to make direct human food from perennial crops. And I think surely we will find out that. And I'm also looking into some other maybe alien crops, but old-fashioned crops like stinging nettle, for example, and loverage, which are usual crops of wild plants that have some very nice properties for production in a larger scale, and might have some good food properties.
Okay, so I think Christel, you were grabbing the mic. So, but now you have to take the mic and say some last words to the world. You have like 10 seconds, then they shut down. You can also thank them for being here if you like. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So thanks all, and we close both to the world and in this room now. Thanks a lot for coming.